Biometric Update. And if not, please do check out biometricupdate.com for the latest digital ID and biometrics news. We at Biometric Update are very pleased to be media partner to Goode Intelligence for Digital Trust World 2021, and also grateful to all of you for joining with us today. We'll begin the session with a presentation from BehavioSec, which is a familiar name to many of you, I know, as a leader in the behavioral biometrics space. And that presentation will be given by Chris Rallis, Head of Fraud and Authentication at BehavioSec, and who came to the company with some subject matter expertise and experience already in fraud, as I understand. I will then moderate a panel made up of Chris, Jordan Blake, VP of Product at BehavioSec, and Alan Goode, who I am sure is familiar to all of you at this point. And we will discuss behavioral biometrics and fraud prevention, not only amongst ourselves, but with all of those of you who would like to participate. So please feel free to ask any questions through the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. I want to just note briefly that Allied Market Research forecast a $3.9 billion market for behavioral biometrics by 2025. And I'd say that's fairly representative of most of the forecasts out there. That would represent dramatic growth, but given all that's been happening in the broader biometric space, I don't think that we should be too surprised by that. With increasing digital engagement, particularly in the banking space, and combined with fraud rates that have been discussed in some earlier sessions as well, seems quite plausible that the next round of forecasts for behavioral biometrics will in fact be more bullish. And especially as the reports of savings start to roll in from implementations. Anecdotally, it seems to me that financial institutions around the world are adopting the technology at an impressive rate. My understanding is that the combined prospect of passive and continuous authentication is really resonating with financial service providers. And so we're fortunate that Chris is here to explain some of what that means and how it works and bring some clarity to the topic in general. So Chris, good to see you again. And I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself and the company and tell us a little bit about behavioral biometrics and how they work and how they can help prevent fraud.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm also Chris. So I'm the fraud and authentication head at BehavioSec. So as Chris mentioned, work for BehavioSec, and basically my role is to partner with customers globally to really educate them on what behavioral biometrics is and how it can be used to mitigate the ever-growing sophisticated digital fraud attacks, while at the same time reducing user friction, especially through this digital transformation, if you will, that we're going through. So thank you so much to the Goode team for inviting us to this great event. Hopefully everyone will find this session helpful and informative. So I'll be going through a presentation for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I believe we have about 30 minutes or so for Q&A. So really looking forward to that as well. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. So if everyone can just bear with me 1 second, please. Okay. I'll put this in slideshow. Okay. Can everyone see the screen okay? Fantastic. Okay, so just a little bit more background about who BehavioSec is. So we were actually founded back in 2008, so almost 14 years now. The company has actually been around, so that might be a little bit interesting because behavioral biometrics might seem to be a newer technology, but the BehavioSec team has been working on this technology for quite some time, and what we've really done over the past decade or so is really making sure that the solution can be commercialized and scaled to effectively, help organizations mitigate fraud and provide a better customer experience. So, really excited to be a part of the team. We have offices in Sweden, UK, and we're also headquartered in San Francisco. So we have a team of about 50 plus people right now. We've grown about 20% in terms of team size over the past year. Some really interesting numbers down here at the bottom. We're protecting over 30 billion transactions annually across the globe, covering over 180 million users, which is growing every single day. We're working with the top Fortune 100 companies, Global 500s, and Global 2000s across the globe. And really, the success that we're having is reducing fraud losses, reducing operational expenses, enabling organizations to grow digitally during digital transformation, and really saving a lot of hours in terms of manual reviews for the fraud teams in terms of alerts and false positives. So really great team here, a lot of strong SMEs and people who are invested in providing a better user experience and making the world more secure. So that's just a little background about who we are as a company. And moving into the next slide, I think this is a term that we all hear, every year, right? Fraud is on the rise, right? But what's really happening right now is not only fraud is on the rise, but fraud is changing in terms of the level of sophistication and tactics that fraudsters are doing to, commit fraud and monetize people's hard-earned money, right? So most of you should know the term authorized push payment fraud. So this is obviously a big one. What we're really seeing is a significant growth since the COVID pandemic in terms of the amount of authorized push payment fraud. Specifically in the UK, we're seeing over $4 million basically on a daily basis where fraudsters are stealing money based on just authorized push payment fraud. So pretty significant increase over the past 2 years. And if you think about what authorized push payment fraud is, essentially fraudsters are, socially engineering victims to unknowingly send money to a fraudster when they think they're sending it to a legitimate person or business, right? And so fraudsters are becoming much more clever in understanding, hey, a lot of these institutions out here have, controls that have been around for quite some time, right? For example, device ID, IP address. And so fraudsters are looking for different ways to beat the traditional controls that we have out there, and simply by having a legitimate customer log in from their known device, they're sending out the transaction. If for some reason a fraud investigation team is reaching out to the customers are saying, yes, I did it. So it's very hard to detect, right? So we're definitely continuing to see that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few more slides and how behavioral biometrics can tackle this type of fraud, which is really exciting. Text and call scams. So this is a really interesting article that I just read about a week ago coming from Ireland. So not only are we seeing a big increase in the UK, but Ireland as well. So you can see that the number of frauds being detected has surged by over 40% over the past year when other crime types have fell during the pandemic. So fraudsters are obviously taking advantage of the fact that we're continuing to move into a more digital world, providing digital services and products, and people are expecting to be able to transact anywhere, anyhow, anytime, right? And fraudsters are taking advantage of that, as well as all the government refunds, the relief programs that are out there to provide relief during the COVID pandemic. And so fraudsters are looking at this as an exceptional opportunity to monetize. And so texting, calling, scams to impersonate that they are, for example, a bank employee calling to authorize a transaction or confirm fraudulent activity on their account. And the victim, unfortunately, is giving out, whether it's PII information, sensitive bank information, and so forth to the fraudster. And what's also really interesting is we're starting to see fraudsters become much more sophisticated in terms of scaling their attacks. So as you can imagine, social engineering and, trying to fish for information from victims can be manually, labor intensive for fraudsters. So fraudsters, just like us, they're looking to scale and innovate in how they're collecting information and stealing information from victims. So we're also seeing some trends around, for example, OTP interception bots. So OTP, those are the one-time passcodes that get sent out to your SMS, and you authorize, the activity or the login request. And fraudsters are able to create bots where they can massively, intercept OTP codes from victims unknowingly, and then go ahead and proceed with a transaction or login request with that customer's account. So just keep that in mind. Bot activity, automated activity is on the rise as well. And that's absolutely something that Behavioral Biometrics and BehavioSec is looking at and addressing very effectively. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides as well. So remote workforce security. This one, I don't think it gets a lot of attention as it should. So as we all know, during the COVID pandemic and really going forward, remote workforce is obviously grown. But employees are, demanding the flexibility to work anywhere, anytime, whether it's a hybrid option, a couple of days in the office, a couple of days at home. So that's here to stay, right? And as a result of that, that opens up, security risk for things like customers' data, sensitive information, that whether it's employees committing fraud or fraudsters getting access to this type of information, right? And so that's the big concern with a lot of these employers in the industry, is the inability to secure communications on external networks outside your organization's control, for example. Help desk scams, that's another big one. So we're actually seeing trends where fraudsters are calling employees who are working from home, impersonating that they're the help desk and they need to get access to the computer to update software, for example, but in reality, they're installing malware or taking over, the machine remotely to, steal sensitive information and or commit fraud, right? So that's another big area that Behavioral Biometrics is working on, is enabling organizations to, monitor behavior of the employees, not necessarily, what they're doing or what they're typing, but, is it the correct person that's behind the device that's, considered the employee. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that works as well later on in the presentation. Fraud and ID theft trending. So this was a very interesting report that I pulled earlier this year. This is actually coming from in the US, the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. This is where consumers can report fraud and or identity theft. And it's pretty striking to see the big shift in the number of reported cases since 2020. So we're obviously seeing a big increase in the US as well. We were seeing approximately 800 to 900,000 reports of fraud and identity theft per quarter prior to COVID. Now we're seeing almost double than that at 1.5 million reports per quarter. And there's some additional information within the reports if you were to go to the website, but imposter scams is the #1 leading category for fraud. And of course, government benefits fraud is the leading identity theft category. So I think the trend is pretty obvious that this is happening globally, not just in Europe, but also in the US. And we're going to continue to expect to see fraudsters take advantage of the environment that we're in today. So the big question is why behavioral biometrics, right? So we just talked about all of the growing fraud trends and threats that we're seeing, the level of sophistication that fraudsters are doing. And so, it comes down to the current controls, which is really, if you think about the controls that we've been deploying probably for the last decade, they've been, somewhat effective, but they're not enough, right? Especially when you look at device, IP, and even behavioral analytics. So I think sometimes I hear behavioral analytics confused for behavioral biometrics. So behavioral analytics is looking at, things like who do you normally transact with, what time of the day do you log in, how often are you logging in, what's your typical dollar amount that you do. But I think we all know that in today's environment, we're transacting differently every day on the go, any type of device, multiple devices. I got an iPad, I got an iPhone, I got my computer, my wife's got devices. So we just can't simply rely on, the historical controls, not only because it's not as effective in identifying the sophisticated fraud attacks that we just talked about, but at the same time, it's causing a lot of friction for users. And so, it's slow, right, in terms of challenging to act before it's too late, creating a lot of noisy alarms, especially for your fraud operation teams and investigation teams, a lot of customer recovery efforts, whether fraud was not detected and or false positives that result in a bad customer experience. So as you can imagine, from a customer experience perspective, and also from a, just an operational expense perspective, it's very challenging. And so, we talked about social engineering, we talked about help desk fraud, authorized push payment fraud, credential stuffing. A lot of these attacks are very hard to detect with the traditional controls, right? So that's why behavioral biometrics is extremely effective. And we'll talk a little bit more about how behavioral biometrics works in a few slides here. But in general, behavioral biometrics not only provide strong security in the types of frauds that we're seeing today, but it's also providing a very frictionless, non-intrusive experience for your customers. So it's invisible multi-factor authentication. It's continuous. So what's really important about continuous is that we talked about, for example, a remote access tool being used. So perhaps the customer is logging in from their device, but unknowingly a fraudster has malware installed and they're able to take over the machine through a remote access tool. So continuous authentication is extremely important because something can happen after the user logs in. So that's what we mean when we say continuous. And so, going to the primary use cases, right? So behavioral biometrics can be used not only for just account takeovers, as we've been talking about, but new account fraud, simply by how a user is entering their information during the application process or the onboarding process. And what's really great about that is, behavioral biometrics is not collecting any PII information. We don't care about, what information is being entered. It's just about how the information is being entered. So just to give you an example, when you enter your name, your address, your date of birth, your government ID, and so forth, the way that you enter that information during the application process should be very smooth. Your behavior demonstrates that you memorize that type of information. Whereas if you're a fraudster, a lot of times what we see is copy and pasting of PII information, or we might see, robotic, automated, information being entered, or, for example, a fraudster, this is their full-time job. So they're, entering multiple applications throughout the day. So they're very, advanced in how they're entering the information and kind of flying through the application process using advanced key combos. Whereas a legitimate person, this is their first time going through the application process. So they're going to be taking their time, reading through the documents, entering the information. So there's a lot of different, factors that we analyze to say, okay, this is a good person, or, based on how this information is being entered, we don't think this is a good person from a new account fraud perspective. And of course, account takeovers, we talked about social engineering, we talked about credential stuffing. We're looking at the behavior of the person logging in to see, does this match the behavioral profile of a known user? So we all behave in a certain way. So whether it's how we type, how we swipe, how we hold a device, and so forth. And so we can easily identify that the person that's logging in or the person that is perhaps taking over this session is not the right person, right? Based on, the behavioral profile of that person. And then from a social engineering perspective, again, this is the really tricky one that we were talking about a few slides ago, where, the customer is logging in, they're actually performing the transaction. But what's really interesting about how we identify these types of scenarios is we can actually identify if the user is being coached. So for example, the victim is on the phone and they're picking up the phone, putting the phone down, picking up the phone again because they're receiving instructions. Perhaps they're hesitating while they're entering the information. So perhaps they have some doubts about what's happening. And so there's very distinct behaviors that we can pick up on that indicates that the person is being coached or being influenced by a potential scammer. And then last but not least is friction. So, as I've mentioned, behavioral biometrics is non-intrusive. There's nothing that the user has to do from a behavioral biometrics perspective other than just behave like you normally do. And so on the good transactions, on the good sessions, behavioral biometrics can be very powerful by simply saying, we know this is Chris logging in. We know this is Chris doing the activity. There's no fraud risk associated. So we can actually reduce friction and just let the user continue on with their transaction. And so what we're seeing, with all of our customers are tremendous results, right? So it's truly a win-win scenario, not only from mitigating fraud, but from improving customer experience, reducing step-ups, right? So you can see these numbers here, reducing false positives by over 91%, reducing step-ups by over 88%, fraud losses by over 99%. Like I mentioned, everything is automated. So behind the scenes, it's non-intrusive, invisible to the user, does not require, additional threat analysts and consultants to, analyze and investigate these sessions. You can use this information real time to make real time decisions, whether it's, automatically approve a transaction, or if you need to take some sort of step up or auto decline. So for example, maybe there's a credential stuffing attack, bot activity, those types of scenarios, you can say, we know it's fraud, let's go ahead and auto decline it. So we can reduce a lot of the manual workload for your fraud operation teams as well. And this next slide, I think is a real nice visual of, kind of, again, comparing the benefits of behavioral biometrics to traditional methods. So from onboarding to login to, really a continuous, fashion, right? So smooth onboarding, only blocking fraud with very little false positive, extreme high accuracy, easy access for your users, fast transactions with little to no friction whatsoever. And that's really, the key here is the entire user journey, from onboarding all the way through their entire relationship with your institution. Behavioral biometrics can provide that seamless experience while making sure that their assets and their information is secure. So this last section here, before we move into Q&A, is I'm just going to talk a little bit more about exactly how behavioral biometrics works. So I know, you might say, oh, this sounds really good, but exactly how does it work, right? So I wanted to take a few minutes here just to explain some key details of how our solution works and how our customers are using our solutions today. So as I mentioned, this is really a continuous zero friction solution. So all the customer or user needs to do is interact with a device, whether it's a mobile app or a website, with no altered or extra steps whatsoever, right? And so behind the scenes, BehavioSec is collecting signals silently, and we're continuously collecting and analyzing that information in real time. In return, we provide what we call a behavior score. So we can tell an organization real time that, yes, this is Chris logging in, and then that organization can make the determination how to proceed with that session, right? Now, if we say that we think there's potential fraud, So for example, we talked about the social engineering scenario. So we might indicate that there's potential coaching or social engineering. And again, you can consume that information in real time and make a real time decision. Do you want to have somebody reach out to the customer to validate that the activity is good and they're not being scammed, as an example. And a little bit more details about what exactly are we looking at in terms of behavior. So we call this deep behavioral patterns. So we're looking at, for example, to the left here, this is kind of like the swipe zone of users. So everybody, when they're swiping on their mobile app, is very different, right? Whether it's the location, the swipe length, the pressure, the curvature, the velocity. And so these are just a few examples of what we collect, but all that information is applied to machine learning algorithms. And that's how we can create a behavioral biometrics profile for that user, and only after one session. So we can, as soon as the solution is deployed, and as soon as users start logging in, we can develop behavioral profiles immediately, so that you can get value on day one in terms of creating behavioral profiles, as well as identifying those sophisticated fraud features and attacks that we talked about. And so this just gives you a little bit more examples of what we're collecting. So we just talked about mobile, but from a desktop perspective, we're also looking at the mouse. So how you're moving a mouse, how you're clicking on a mouse, how you're entering information on the keyboard, your press, flight, and sequence. So those are all additional types of information that we collect from a desktop perspective to create the behavioral profiles. And then from an environmental perspective, we're looking at device information, IP address, GPS location, language settings, browser versions, and we also have a fraud consortium feature. So if there's a known fraud device, we can flag on that. So we combine all of that information in addition to a behavioral biometrics assessment to really provide a very rich and accurate score. And then this is really just showing a sample deployment of how BehavioSec can be deployed. So really the way that it works is that we have a BehavioSec SDK, which can be used as a JavaScript for your web in iOS and Android devices. And so once that's deployed, we immediately start collecting information that we just talked about in the prior slides. One thing to note is we have a couple of different deployment options. So we have on-premise, we have private cloud, BehavioSec hosted, and cloud agnostic. So we have many different options in terms of deployment. We also, if you go to www.behaviosec.com and click on our partner tab, we work with a lot of platform partners that many of you are probably familiar with. So we're very ecosystem friendly in terms of working with identity and access management tools, orchestration and risk management tools. So that's also another option for deploying our solution. And again, once we do the analysis, we provide a behavior score as well as a risk score from a fraud perspective. And so all this information can be consumed, for example, via API, in which you can make real-time decisions within your risk and orchestration tools in terms of how you want to proceed with the transaction, or if you want to alert your fraud team for a potential review and investigation. And then this just gives you a little sample of what it looks like within our dashboard and what API response like. This is just giving you a snapshot of the dashboard of a session where bot is detected. So this is what it. I'm getting an internet unstable message here. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yes. Okay. So yeah. This is just giving you information we put within a dashboard that's available to all our users, but this is also the information that we share via our API response. so that you can collect things like, is there a bot? Is the user being coached? And things of that nature. And last but not least, within our dashboard, we also have a session replay feature. I really like this as a fraud practitioner. I love seeing this. I'm just going to play this. Again, going back to my earlier comment, we're not collecting information. We're not collecting what your users are entering. So you can see this is a mouse pad user, and we're like, are they doing certain advanced codes, navigating through the keyboard and how they're using their mouse. So this is just giving you a little visual replay of that user interaction. That's available within our dashboard for investigations. So before I hand it back over to Chris, just again, if you have any follow-up questions pertaining to BehavioSec, you can reach me directly, craylis@behaviosec.com, or visit our website at behaviosec.com. So I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was very informative and yeah, raised a lot of great points. And I'm pleased to see a couple of really, really interesting questions come in from the audience already as well. So I'd just like to get right to those and ask you, Lee Lambert has a great question. You referred to some of the deployment options and possibilities, and Lee asks, how open are financial institutions to having the SDK in their app, and is this a point of contention? How do banks and financials feel about this kind of integration?
Yeah, I can probably take that one, Chris. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's not generally an issue for most financial institutions integrating behavioral capture SDK into their applications. It's not generally what I'd call a point of contention. There is some effort in order to do it, of course, but it's not typically a lot of work. So we have an SDK for web, iOS, and Android, and it's a few lines of code. And once that's done, the behavior capture can be done, passed to backend for the processing.
And when that process is complete, how long, Chris referred to building behavioral profiles. So how long does it take once the solution is being deployed for the fraud prevention results to start rolling in?
Yeah, so it'll provide value right away. There's not really any manual tuning that's required. There's several models that are built in that can detect things like anomalies, automation, bots, remote access tools, even scams involving remote coaching, as well as new account fraud. And all of that can be done sort of right off the bat. And then beyond that, you have behavioral profiling. And that can achieve reliable accuracy for a pretty good chunk of users after only one session, with the vast majority of them typically fully trained after, about 5 or 6 sessions.
So you've logged in a few times, you've used the system a few times, 5 or 6, as you say, and that it knows you.
Exactly. And of course, it doesn't stop getting to know you after a few sessions. It's constantly watching for changes in behavior and incorporating those into the profile so that they stay relevant and fresh.
Great, thank you. And another really good question that brings up, dovetails very nicely with, from Diane Joyce. How do you explain to a customer what data is being captured, how it is being used, and who has access to it? It's obviously a little bit different than imagining a selfie or a fingerprint template. So how do you explain that? And yeah, could you address that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the data that's being captured is effectively behavioral timing data. So If you can imagine someone typing their username and password, we're not interested in the actual password itself. Most of our customers don't want us collecting such PII, but we're more interested in how you're entering that, that password, or how you are interacting, how you're gesturing, and other sort of interactions that you're having. So, you know, we basically, this is divulged typically in privacy policies. So organizations will explain that they're capturing this timing data. It's being used to authenticate users and nothing else. We are not, you know, using this to determine, you know, protected classes like your age, your race, religion, sex, gender identity, et cetera, et cetera. All of these broadly protected classes are not things that you're going to be gathering or doing anything with using behavioral biometrics. Furthermore, I'd point out that you know, behavioral biometrics is really inherently different from, you know, static or physical biometrics, in that it's really this collection of an individual's behavior at a specific time in a specific context. So no one can use behavioral profile data to find you elsewhere the way, say, someone who lifted your fingerprint could try to match it against an external database. So even if criminals somehow manage to breach a vulnerable organization, the most they could gain really is an imprint of how a user swiped and typed on that particular UI or journey at that point in time. The data is not usable elsewhere. So these are the kinds of things that we would divulge to customers. And of course, you know, in terms of who has access to it, it's not going to be anyone outside of that particular organization.
So it sounds like really end users, consumers are not looking at how long, the amount of time, the number of milliseconds it takes between me typing the C and the H at the beginning of entering my name into a field. That's not the same, looked at the same way as the physical biometric template or the selfie that's being uploaded or something like that in terms of privacy.
Exactly. So this is, you know, this is data that can be used in the specific context that it was captured, not in another context. It's not useful to find you. You know, if you enter your login information, or if we're doing continuous capture at bank A, we can't take that and find you at bank B or on social media or in any other context. It's really specific to the place, the time and place that it was captured.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think that's really gets at the heart of what's different about behavioral biometrics than the other modalities that we've been talking about over the last day or so. So on that note, the title of the session refers to versatility, and Chris referred to some of the things that you can do with that really highly contextual data that, you know, are just not normally in scope for this kind of technology or for some related technologies, let's say. So maybe I could ask both of you, or all three of you really, you know, how you see that versatility, both in terms of what it is and in terms of the value that brings beyond what we typically think of as authentication.
Yeah, so I can maybe, you know, start by offering a few thoughts on that. You know, one of the most unique features of behavioral biometrics is that the data can be captured continuously throughout a session. So, you know, when we talk about versatility, that's versatility that you don't really, that's something you don't get with virtually any other authentication technology. So you can't realistically ask someone, for example, to continuously provide their fingerprint or scan their face over and over and over again within a session. But with behavior, you're sort of capturing that naturally throughout the user's regular usage of the application. So this continuous authentication, this notion of continuous authentication becomes a viable strategy. And then, related to that point, there's not really any friction added. So in fact, you can actually reduce friction by replacing or augmenting existing authentication factors with behavior. So the user goes about their business and the behavioral data is captured silently in the background without asking questions, puzzles, or making them pull out another device. And then I would say also that behavioral biometrics is trained in the background as well. So you also don't need any sort of registration flow like you typically would for, say, face or fingerprint biometric.
Yeah, and I would just add, just from a fraud practitioner perspective, I mentioned there's opportunities to use behavioral biometrics to reduce false positives, right? Manual case reviews, identify fraud much more upstream, right? So what I mean by that is, we can identify a fraudster, attempting to log in and or right before a transaction taking place. So you're eliminating all that downstream efforts that you have to do in terms of recalling fraudulent funds, securing the account and so forth, right? So from a fraud practitioner perspective, that really makes me really excited because, that's extremely important in terms of providing my fraud analysts, high quality alerts to review and making sure that we're reducing a lot of that, noise and unnecessary work. So that's really important too.
Yeah, and I think from my point of view, from an analyst, it's versatility is seen. It's a great tool for use in both supporting convenient, secure authentication, and also as a tool for supporting fraud management. And you can see that in one of the slides that Chris had up earlier on. It was, you see the partners that you're working with. It's companies like Nice Actimize, or Nice with Actimize, and from the fraud point of view, and with the authentication partners in terms of ensuring, supporting the need for kind of convenient, frictionless authentication from an experience point of view. So I think behavioral is from an analyst point of view, as I said in my interview with Neil Costigan earlier on today, it's sometimes a difficult one to categorize. It fits across a lot of different disciplines and technologies and teams within organizations across the auth team, across the fraud team. So, but it's I think that for me that's it's fantastic kind of worth as a versatile tool.
Great, and I mean, what's one of the things that's really striking to me in terms of that versatility too is when you talk about social engineering and some of those capacities where the legacy technologies are of no use at all, essentially, right? And then we have some next generation technologies, or what we might call next generation technologies, that are also not really helping very much, frankly, in that kind of regard. So, but that also makes me think of another question too, which is that my typing speed, I know, slows down a little bit over the course of the day. My articles written in the evening take much longer than those in the morning. And I'm sure that's fairly typical. So, can you just talk a little bit maybe about how that works with behavioral biometrics? Are they affected? Is it better if some of those sessions are in the morning, in the evening, as it's learning, or does it matter?
Really good question. So I'd make a few points. So first of all, with modern machine learning models, the expectation is that your current behavior will be similar, but not identical to previous sessions. In fact, if it is identical, then it's typically a sign of a possible replay attack. And of course, that can be detected, right? So we don't expect to see identical behavior from session to session, of course, because that's not how legitimate users and people interact. So the algorithms themselves are designed to avoid this sort of brittleness problem. This was actually a challenge for behavioral biometrics prior to the advent of modern machine learning. And that's, of course, what underlies all of the current implementation. So, to your question specifically, if your behavior changes due to tiredness or an injury, let's say, you may be surprised to find out that there's often still individual behavioral markers that remain similar enough to verify it's you, even if the cadence is slower or has pauses or interruptions. And then I'd also say that, in cases where, behavior is wildly different, you still have to take the perspective that, behavioral biometrics is never really deployed in a vacuum. You're still collecting other data that helps establish identity. Things like device characteristics, location, device possession, and so forth. So in the rare event that behavioral biometrics indicates a very high risk for you when you're authenticating, you can always set up a traditional form verification and use that as a step up before making a final auth decision. The advantage, of course, is that instead of relying on frictionful authentication experiences most or all of the time, it's relegated to these sort of very rare occurrences.
So the layering and the architecture of the solution is important to actually get the most out of the technology.
Exactly.
Great. Now I want to move a little bit into the customer side of things now, and we've talked a little bit about behavioral biometrics in terms of preventing fraud with financial institutions, and several of Chris's slides, referred pretty directly to the financial sector use cases, and I think it's clear that financial institutions have been leading the adoption curve so far. But my impression is that that there's a little bit of change happening in the area and with the technology and its adoption curve. So can you talk a little bit about other verticals that are considering or beginning to adopt behavioral?
Yeah, sure. So, the technology itself is largely agnostic to vertical and plays pretty well within, identity and authentication teams as well, those that are perhaps looking for ways to reduce friction, improve security. So we've started to see the technology used in gig economy situations, for example, for remote workforce authentication, detection of fraud during new account onboarding, detection of credential stuffing, detection of bots, automation, malware detection, and even augmenting multi-factor authentication for workforces. And I would say that there's been pretty broad interest in the technology for digital transformation initiatives for both consumer and workforce in the last couple of years in particular. So there is sort of this shift away from big bank fraud, which is sort of where we cut our teeth, more than a decade ago, to sort of this broader opening up of verticals and enterprise organizations of various sizes.
Yeah, we had an engagement with a Florida-based company who are a call center provider. They provide platforms and they provide outsourced call center solution services for many organizations. And that was at the beginning of the pandemic. And one of the issues that they had was that they go through the identity verification for call center to comply with regulations, especially if you're working in financial services or telecommunications. Then, if you're a call center worker, you need to go through clearance, criminal checks, etc. So what they were finding in some regions, because they were outsourcing out to other regions in the world, they were finding that the person they onboarded that call center operative, but then they were then farming it out to family members, so that these were unchecked kind of people working, in the call center. So they were, and we did a bit of analysis, and when we came up with a recommendation for using behavioral, because it's a way of actually determining that it was the actual person who's been checked, been verified, that was actually at the end of that particular call, rather than someone else who may be open up to fraud, etc. So that was a nice little at the beginning of the pandemic, as everything was moving online. I think it's a good different application that we came across.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that I'm hearing and seeing a lot about is the passwordless. That's a big phrase out there, right? So it doesn't have to be a bank; it can be any type of institution out there that's looking to make access to applications and data much more convenient, and passwordless is the key thing, right? And so what do you do in lieu of passwords, right? And behavioral biometrics is one of the top things that come up to in terms of replacing the passwordless, or the passwords, if you will. So
yeah, there's really no ends to. I mean, by the time the contact center and passwordless examples both. I mean that those can kind of stand in for any any enterprise and any online account or any digital accounts.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've definitely heard of a lot of interest in organizations that have authentication solutions, that have mechanisms in place, and they just feel that it's not enough. They want another layer, right? So I think that's seems to be one of the trends in the market as well, is adding that. Yeah. So Jordan's just addressing a question from Diane in the Q&A, but I think it's a really good one, so I want to call it out as well. And that is, Diane points out bad actors are getting more advanced, and what stops them creating malware, she says, that captures the data needed and replaying it. How does the biometric do a liveliness test?
Yeah, excellent question. So you basically have replay attack detection. So someone captures keystrokes and then replays those back to the system. It will actually recognize that this is a carbon copy of an interaction that's already happened. And so that will raise a flag that will obviously be used to prevent that account from being breached. And there are other sophisticated ways to detect tampering with sessions. So if you try to feed the data externally, that can be detected. There's a whole slew of sort of technological factors that prevent that from happening. Without getting into too many of the technical details, there are a number of different ways of kind of ensuring that it's the true user who's entering the data.
So even if someone records my session with the bank that I do have my checking account with, who have for some reason been so foolish as to set up the exact same form in the exact same way as the bank that I have my savings account with, you still have ways of detecting that that the signal is being changed along the way or coming from a different place.
Exactly.
Okay, very good. So yeah, let's. I would like to ask. We were talking about how great this technology is and where it can fit in all these different sort of use cases. So what is the adoption rate like for behavioral biometrics right now? Alan, you want to?
Yeah, it's definitely growing. I think we hinted on it really. I think traditionally, if you look at BehavioSec's kind of initial, client base, it was and other players in this market. It's highly regulated, financial services, banks, payment providers. So with EU's PSD, strong customer authentication. It actually, especially in the UK, the FCA, who are the financial regulator, explicitly call out kind of behavioral biometrics as a factor, as a technology that they recommend to be adopted to support SCA. So outside of that, it's spreading. Jordan mentioned about the gig economy. We've talked about call centers, telecommunications, e-commerce, kind of dating apps, etc. So there has been you mentioned a good number earlier on at the beginning of the presentation, Chris. So it's I think it's on an upward trajectory. It's been more widely adopted in the traditional highly regulated space, but it's breaking out of those areas into adjacent areas to support kind of fraud management and seamless, frictionless authentication.
Great. So we're drawing near the end of our time, but I just want to squeeze in one more quick question. If you'll all bear with me, I just wanted to go around the horn and make a statement and get your take. Feel free to agree or disagree, but is my impression that these regulatory influences, as Alan just referred to, are actually creating a little bit of a tailwind for behavioral biometrics rather than a hindrance, as we might otherwise think. Agree or disagree? Chris, what would you say?
I would agree. I just actually posted a blog about a week ago on the FFIEC recommending behavioral biometrics, the social engineering. There's a Reg E, it's Consumer Protection Financial Bureau update earlier this year in terms of customers that are victims of scams. These institutions are going to be liable if there's an actual loss, even though the customer initiated the funds. So I would absolutely agree that it's making behavioral biometrics much more important and relevant.
Alan, agree, disagree?
Yeah, I agree. And also, it's going to be less likely to fall outside of GDPR as well. So a lot of the other, it's less likely to be considered as all the statements that Chris and Jordan made earlier on to be considered PII, and that's been proven in a number of court cases as well. So from a GDPR point of view, it's compliant, and that's a big positive for any organization that is deploying a biometric technology.
Absolutely. So as you can see, and as was made clear in your presentation, Chris, the promise of authentication that's not just accurate, but also low friction, passive, continuous. These factors have made behavioral biometrics an intriguing technology to all sorts of online service providers, particularly in financial services, but not just in financial services, as we've been discussing. The pandemic has definitely accelerated the adoption of this technology, and we've discussed a whole range of the reasons why, and the reasons why that's likely to continue. So I know that the concept is familiar to some, but it's still fairly new to some people as well. So it's good to hear from some people who have been thinking about it quite a bit for quite a while. I personally think that it's on the road to becoming ubiquitous in several sections of the market in pretty short order, in part because of the regulatory reasons that we've just talked about. So I just want to thank you all very much for joining us today, and not just listening, but also for participating in the discussion. Thank you, Chris, for the presentation, and thank you as well to Jordan and Alan for diving down on the topic a little bit, as they say. And it's really been my pleasure to moderate this panel, and I look forward to connecting with you